Imagine, if you will, that you are standing before a painting hung in some quiet gallery, the sort of canvas a visitor passes and then returns to without quite knowing why. The frame is plain gilt, a little tarnished at the corners, and within it a walled garden lies steeped in the gold of a long summer afternoon. Pear trees crowd the further wall, their blossom gone over to a froth of cream, and the first hard green fruit already setting on the boughs. Along the south-facing bank, where the brick has drunk the heat of the day, a row of straw steps sits dome upon dome, like a congregation of little churches, and the air above them is so thick with bees that the paint itself seems to hum. In the foreground, a girl kneels. She is perhaps 11 years old, in a dove-gray frock, with the hem grass-stained, her hair coming loose from its ribbon, and she has her bare hands cupped beneath a hanging swarm, a great dark teardrop of bees the size of a sleeping cat, depending from the lowest pear branch, and she is not afraid. That is what arrests the eye and holds it. Every other figure one has ever seen near such a thing leans away, an arm thrown up, a shawl flung over the head. This child leans in. Her face is lifted toward the swarm with the grave attention of a person reading, and the bees pour over her wrists and forearms in a living glove, and do not sting her, and a woman in widow's black stands a little behind with her hand pressed to her own mouth, watching and not calling the child away. Hold that picture a moment. Mark the woman in black, for we shall come to her. Mark the unafraid child most of all. Then let the gallery dissolve, the gilt frame with it, the gold light and the humming air, for it was none of it present, none of it now. It was 15 summers gone, in a garden the child would not see again for a very long while, and the painting hangs only in memory, in one memory, the woman's, and we shall come to that too, and the present is a far plainer thing, and it is raining. It was raining at Tewkesbury, a thin grey rain that had set in before dawn and meant to stay, sliding down the small panes of the parsonage parlour, and pooling in the lead of the casement. Theodosia Marchmont sat at the table beneath the window, with the day's mending in her lap, and did not sew. She was 26 now, of middle height and unhurried carriage, her dark honey-brown hair pinned simply beneath a plain linen cap. Her eyes were a level grey-green that rested on a thing a moment longer than most people's did before she spoke, and at present they rested on nothing. On the middle distance of the wet garden, while her hands lay still over the half-darned stocking. She wore half-mourning still, a dove-grey stuff gown, and over it a darker grey spencer against the chill of the room, and at her throat a single jet brooch that held a curl of her late father's hair. The Reverend Josiah Marchmont had been dead 11 months. The parsonage was not hers and never had been. It belonged now to the new incumbent, a young married man with a wife near her time, and they had been kindness itself in letting her remain these few weeks while she settled her affairs, but there was a particular quality to being kept on out of kindness that Theodosia had come to know very well, and she did not mistake it for welcome. She knew it well because she had lived inside it for 6 years. When her father's small income died with him, his elder daughter, there was no other, her mother long gone, no brother to take her in, had done the thing a clergyman's portionless daughter does, and gone out as a companion. Mrs. Audley Pevensey of Cheltenham had wanted a quiet, useful, gently bred young woman to read aloud of an evening, to carry the second basket, to sit up with her when the rheumatism kept her wakeful, to manage the lending library books and the morning callers and the dull stretches of an idle widow's day, and Theodosia had been all of those things, and competent at every one, for the better part of 6 years. She had asked for little and complained of nothing. She had made herself, in the precise phrase her father might have used, useful to others and the owner of nothing of her own, not a room that could not be wanted back, not an hour that was hers by right, not a single object in the world that mattered to anyone but herself. And then in April Miss Pevensey, the daughter of the house, had married a Bristol attorney and gone to keep her own establishment, and Mrs. Pevensey had announced, with no unkindness and a good deal of comfortable feeling for her own arrangements, that with her daughter wed she should travel, should winter at Bath, should have no further need of a companion sitting about the house eating her head off, and had given Theodosia a quarter's wages, a worn fur tippet she did not want, and her freedom. So Theodosia had come home to Tewkesbury, to a home that was no longer one, to bury what remained of her father's affairs, and to consider, without any visible alarm but with a perfectly clear understanding of the figures. What a woman of 26 with £40 in the world, and no situation was to do next. She did not weep over it. She was not, by any disposition she could discover in herself, a weeping woman. Her grief for her father had gone deep and quiet and stayed there, in a place she did not show to lodging-house landladies or to former employers' kind farewells. And her present circumstances she regarded much as she would have regarded a swarm settled in an awkward place, high in a thorn, say, or up under the eave of a barn, where no skep could be brought to it, a thing to be dealt with calmly, by knowledge and a level hand, by patience and the right hour of the day, and never by flapping. Flapping, she had observed, was what undid most people about most things. It was certainly what undid them about bees. The bees themselves were rarely the trouble. What she did instead, on the wet mornings, was think about bees. She had her own bee book in the bottom of her trunk, a thin, marbled volume in which she had kept, in a small clear hand, such observations as a companion's borrowed scraps of time allowed, the date a neighbor's skep had cast its swarm, the weight of a hive lifted in the palm, a note on whether the Perry blossom or the late clover gave the better autumn flow. It was the one competence that was entirely hers, learned nowhere any lady ought to have learned it, and she held opinions upon it. Upon the straw skep against the new wooden octagon hive, upon the driving of bees at the harvest against their cruel destruction over the brimstone pit, settled opinions, which she had long ago given up offering at any table, since a gentlewoman who spoke of bees with authority was reckoned an eccentric, and a gentlewoman who handled them bare-handed was reckoned very nearly a fright. So she kept the bee book private, and thought her thoughts, and said little, and that, until this rainy morning, was the whole compass of her prospects. It was a little before noon that she heard the carrier's cart in the lane. She heard it before she saw it, the particular slap and suck of hooves and iron-bound wheels in the soft mud. And then, old Pertwee the Hereford carrier was at the parsonage gate hallooing through the rain, and the new incumbent's girl ran out under a sacking, and ran back with a letter held inside her apron against the wet. There was little post for Theodosia in these days. The few who had written to condole had condoled and done. So she took the letter with mild surprise, and turned it to the light of the window, and saw that the direction was in a clerkly copperplate she did not know, that the seal was a good red wax pressed with a device of scales and a wheat sheaf, and that the postmark, where the rain had not blurred it, said Hereford. She broke the seal with her thumb, and unfolded a single large sheet, closely written, and read it through once at the window in the grey light, and then, because she had learned long ago to distrust the first reading of any document that mattered, she read it through again, more slowly, from the top. "Madam," it began, "I have the honor to address you on a matter of some consequence touching the estate of the late Mrs. Sabina Loder, widow, of B. Holt in the parish of St. Dubricius, at Marden-under-Croft, in this county of Hereford, who departed this life on the 14th day of May last, in the 71st year of her age. You will, I apprehend, have had little or no knowledge of the lady in recent years, and I am instructed that you met her but once, in your childhood, the more reason, therefore, that I should set the case plainly before you. By her last will and testament, drawn in this office and dated the autumn of the year 14, Mrs. Loder has named you, Theodosia Marchmont, spinster, daughter of the late Reverend Josiah Marchmont of Tewkesbury, her sole heiress, and to you she has devised and bequeathed the freehold of B. Holt, with its mansion house, offices, and gardens. The home farm of 51 acres with its stock and standing crops, the sum invested in the public funds, the particulars whereof I shall furnish at our meeting, and, I copy the words of the will, that you may have them exactly as the lady set them down, the apiary and all that pertains to it. The letter went on to its business in the dry full sentences of a careful man, that he was Mr. Halloran Pike, attorney and solicitor, of the Cathedral Close at Hereford, 33 years in that practice, and had had the conduct of Mrs. Loder's affairs for the most of them, that he must beg the favor of an interview at his chambers at her early convenience, or, should travel be inconvenient to her, would wait upon her himself, that the household at B. Holt continued under the housekeeper Mrs. Tranter, and the steward Mr. Wren, and awaited her instruction, and that he had the honor to subscribe himself her most obedient humble servant, Halloran Pike. Theodosia laid the sheet flat upon the table, and smoothed it once with her hand, as though to be quite sure the words would not rearrange themselves while she looked away, and the half-darned stocking slid unregarded from her lap to the floor. Sabina Loder. She turned the name over and reached for what little she had of the woman, and found, to her own surprise, nothing. Her godmother. She had been told, as a girl, that she had a godmother. A connection of her dead mother's, a widow somewhere west toward Wales who kept no carriage and went nowhere, and was reckoned by the Marchmont side a trifle odd, and she had been taken to see her once, the whole of once, the summer she was 11, on some long jolting journey she remembered now chiefly as a smell of dust and a numbness in her feet, and there had been a garden. A walled garden, brick-warm, with pear trees and a bank of straw hives, and a swarm hanging in a great soft cluster from a low branch, and an old gardener flapping his hat and the maids shrieking indoors, and the child Theodosia, who had not the sense or the fear to know better, walking straight up to the thing and putting her 2 bare hands beneath it because it had looked, she had thought, like something that wanted holding. The bees had not stung her. She had stood with a glove of them up to her elbows and felt the enormous gentle weight of them and the dry warmth and the sound, that was not one sound but 1,000, and she had not been afraid, and there had been a woman in widow's black standing behind her who had not screamed and had not snatched her back, but had only watched, with her hand pressed to her own mouth, and afterward had knelt down in the grass before the child, level with her face, and said something Theodosia had carried 15 years without once examining. "You are not afraid of them. Most people are." They knew it directly. That was all. She had never seen the woman again. There had been, she thought now, a present once or twice in the years after, a book of the natural history of insects with hand-colored plates, sent at no birthday she could account for. A small jar of dark honey at a Christmas, with no card, and her father had said vaguely that her godmother remembered her, and Theodosia, busy with the long blank labor of growing up poor and useful, had not much wondered at it. She wondered at it now. 15 years of silence, and a single afternoon in a walled garden, and at the end of it a house and a name and 4 particular words copied out by a careful man. And now, the woman in widow's black was dead, and had left her a house, and had thought, in the autumn of the year 14, with her own hand upon the pen, to set the apiary down by name above the silver, and the orchard, and the acres, as though she had wished, across all that distance of years and silence, to be quite certain that the one person in the world, to whom those bees would mean what they had always meant to her, should be the one to keep them. Into the parlor, drawn by the carrier's halloo and the unwonted event of a sealed letter, came the new incumbent's wife, heavy with her own approaching business, and behind her the maid, and the small wet excitement of a household to which nothing ever happened gathered at Theodosia's shoulder. An estate, a house and land left whole to Miss Marchmont, who but yesterday had not known where she should be settled by Michaelmas. The young wife exclaimed and pressed her hands together. The maid forgot herself so far as to peer at the letter, and a clamor of the natural questions broke over Theodosia where she sat. How many acres, and was the house a good one, and what would the funds bring in the year, and was there silver, was there a carriage, and how soon might she go to see it, and was she not the most fortunate creature in the 3 counties? All the proper questions, the questions any sensible person would ask, the questions Theodosia herself would have called sensible, had she heard another woman ask them. She heard them as if from the far side of the rain. She was looking at 4 words on the page: the apiary and all that pertains to it. Mr. Pike had thought them worth copying out exactly. The dead woman had thought them worth setting down at all, in a will that troubled itself with little else by name, not the silver, nor the linen, nor the pear orchard, but the apiary, named, and all that pertained to it. And the new incumbent's wife was saying, with the kindest curiosity in the world, "But Theodosia, my dear, what does it all come to? What is the place worth?" And Theodosia found that the question forming itself in her own mind, the single question that had risen ahead of every other and would not be put down, was not what the place was worth at all. "I must write to Mr. Pike by the return," she said, and her voice was so even that the young wife stopped short, expecting tears perhaps, or at least the proper trembling of joy, and finding neither. Theodosia had already risen and gone to the little writing slope on the side table and lifted the lid for the inkstand and a sheet of paper. There is one thing I must know before any other, and he is the only person living who can tell me." She mended a pen with the small steady movements of a woman whose hands did not shake, and dipped it, and the young wife and the maid leaned in, certain now of what the great anxious question of an heiress must be: the rents, the mortgage, the soundness of the funds, the state of the roof. Theodosia wrote the date and the salutation, and then, while 4 pairs of eyes waited upon the sum of the inheritance, she asked her godmother's solicitor the only thing in the world that she truly wished to know. She asked him whether the bees still stood. The hired chaise came for her on a Thursday morning, and the carrier handed up her single trunk, and her father's writing box, and the small leather case in which she kept her own bee-book. And then there was nothing left to do at the Tewkesbury parsonage, but climb in and be carried away from the only county she had ever called her own. Theodosia Marchmont sat very upright against the worn squabs, with her gloved hands folded, and watched the spire of the church she had been christened in slide behind a screen of elms, and she did not weep, because she had learned a long while since that weeping settled nothing, and woke a headache, and because the thing in her breast was not grief so much as a kind of held breath, the held breath of a woman riding toward a place she could not yet picture, and a competence the world had never before thought worth a shilling. The postboy clucked to the horses, the wheels found the rutted Worcester road, and the morning opened ahead of her pale and washed, with a thin sun working at the mist that lay along the water meadows. She had asked Mr. Pike, by return of the same carrier who brought his letter, only the one question, whether the bees still stood, and she had not yet had his answer. And so she rode west toward the Holt, carrying the question with her like a coal in a warming pan, turning it over, wondering whether she should find a living bank of skeps, or a row of cold straw, and a robbed and empty honey house. The road climbed all the long forenoon, and by the time the chaise had labored up and over the high green wall of the Malverns, the held breath had eased a little, for there is a point on that ridge where the whole of the marches lies suddenly spread below like a thing painted on a fair day platter, and Theodosia, who had spent her 24 working years in the flat tame meadows of the Severn, leaned to the glass and forgot for a moment to keep her face composed. Westward the land fell away in long folds of orchard and hedgerow toward a silver crook of river she took to be the Lug, and the pear trees stood in their hundreds along the slopes with the last of their late summer green upon them, and beyond all of it, blue and tumbled, and very far, rose the Welsh hills with a single drift of cloud caught upon the highest of them like wool snagged on a thorn. Sheep moved white across a near pasture, a hawk hung still on the wind above the chaise, and then slid sideways and was gone. The very air that came in at the loosened window strap smelled different here, greener and wetter and sweeter, of cut bracken and ripening fruit, and the faint vegetable breath of the river, and somewhere under all of it, or so she let herself imagine, the warm and unmistakable smell of honey. She marked the orchards as the chaise wound down among them, with an eye no idle traveler would have turned upon them, for a woman who keeps bees learns to read a country by its blossom as a sailor reads a coast by its headlands, and she saw at a glance that this was bee country of the first order, pear and apple, and the white drift of late bramble in the hedge bottoms. Lime trees standing in a churchyard they passed, and on the higher slopes a purpling that she took, with a small leap of the heart she did not show, for the first of the heather coming into its bloom. A land that could feed a bank of skeps from the pear blossom of April clean through to the moor heather of September was a land worth the inheriting, whatever else it held. And she filed the knowledge away beside her question and her caution, 3 things now riding west together in the jolting box. She thought, with the dry inward humor that was her armor, and her comfort both, that a woman could do worse than be turned out of one county into a country as fair as this, and then she sat back and folded her hands again, and would not let herself hope too far ahead. For hope was a thing she had been taught to ration as carefully as candle ends. It was past 4 by the church clocks, when the chaise turned off the Hereford turnpike at a finger-post that read Marden under Croft, and went down a narrowing lane between high banks crowned with hazel, and so came at last, with a grinding of the brake, to a pair of brick gate piers gone soft and rounded with age, beyond which a short drive of trodden gravel ran up to the house called Bee Holt. Theodosia had the postboy set her down at the piers, and walked the last of it on her own feet, because she wished to come to the place slowly, and to look at it before it looked at her. The Holt was a modest manor of warm Marches brick and weathered oak timber, 2 stories and an attic of dormer windows. With a roof of stone tiles furred green at the ridge and a stout chimney stack at either gable, and it stood with its back to the rising ground and its face turned south over a walled garden toward the gleam of the lug below. It was no great house. It was the house, she thought, of a gentlewoman of sense and small means who had cared more for her ground than for her drawing-room. And the thought of the unknown Mrs. Sabina Loder, dead now, and named only in a solicitor's hand, came over her with a sudden unlooked-for tenderness, so that she stood a moment at the gate with her hand on the warm brick and felt herself, for the first time, the inheritor of a real and breathing place rather than of a paragraph in a letter. A gray-haired woman in a linen cap had come to the south door at the sound of the wheels, and stood now, wiping her hands upon her apron, and looking down the drive with the guarded courtesy of a servant, who has not yet been told what to think. This, Theodosia would learn within the hour, was Mrs. Edith Tranter, housekeeper of the Holt these many years, and keeper of all its keys. Iron gray beneath the cap and upright as a hayfork, who had buried her mistress a fortnight since, and held the household together by main will in the empty time between. A little behind her, come round from the stable yard at the noise, stood a weathered, plain-faced man of middle years in gaiters and a frieze coat, turning his hat in his 2 hands, Mr. Jago, Wren, steward of the home farm and its 51 acres, weather-creased and slow-spoken and, as it would prove, as honest as the daylight. Theodosia raised her hand to them both in greeting across the gravel, and they bowed and bobbed in their turn, and she might then have gone straight up to the door, and into the cool dark hall and the business of keys and introductions, and a dish of tea, as any tired traveler in her senses would have done. But she did not. She had caught, on the wind that came up out of the walled garden, a sound, and the sound stopped her where she stood and turned her clean away from the house. She went to the bee-bank before she went to the door. It was a thing she could not have helped doing had the king himself been waiting on the step. And she knew it for an oddness in herself, and had long since ceased to apologize for it. The walled garden lay to the south of the house behind a door of grey oak set in the brick, and she let herself through it, and came into a green and overgrown paradise of physic beds run to seed and espaliered fruit, and a great tangle of late roses, and along the far wall. On a raised south-facing bank, warmed all day by the brick at its back, stood the apiary of B. Holt, a long row of straw skeps upon their stools, 8 or 9 of them, plump and domed, and weathered to the color of old thatch, and at the end of the row, set a little apart as though it were a newcomer not yet sure of its welcome, one wooden hive of 8 sides, painted a fading grain. Plainly the late mistress's experiment with the modern fashion. An old tabby cat lay along the warm sill of the little brick honey house at the bank's end, and did not trouble to rise. And Theodosia Marchmont, 26, dismissed companion and orphan, and now mistress of all she surveyed, stood at the foot of that bank in her dusty dove-gray traveling gown, with her bonnet strings loosed, and her head a little tilted, and listened to her bees. She listened the way another woman might read a letter held to the light, and her face, which had stayed composed through dismissal and orphanhood and the long jolting road, changed by slow degrees into something between attention and sorrow, for the bank was wrong. She did not need to lift a single skep to know it. The wrongness was in the air, in the very pitch of the place. From most of the skeps came nothing at all, not so much as the dry whisper of a comb settling. Only a dead and wadded silence that no living stock ever keeps even in the depth of its winter cluster, and from 2 or 3 of the others rose a thin, fretful, aimless note, high and uneven and querulous, the unmistakable broken hum of a colony gone queenless and unhappy, a stock with no mother to center it, and no purpose left but to dwindle. She stood among them, and read it all by ear as plainly as another would read it from a page. The failed stocks, the swarms that must have gone off in the empty season after her godmother fell ill and no hand to take them, the 2 poor queenless remnants fretting toward their end. Hesketh would tell her more, when she found Hesketh, but she did not need telling. The bees of B. Holt had been let go untended through a hard season, and the bank that should have roared with the late flow stood half of it dead and the rest of it grieving. She crouched and laid her ungloved palm flat against the warm straw of the nearest silent skep, the way she had laid it against a hanging swarm, once when she was 11 years old and afraid of nothing, and felt no answering warmth of life within, only the sun's heat dying out of the straw as the afternoon cooled. A living stock keeps its own heat even in a poor season, a banked and breathing warmth at the heart of the cluster that the bare hand knows the instant it is laid on, and where that warmth is wanting, the keeper need ask no further. She moved along the bank to the painted octagon hive at its end, and stooped to set her ear close against the wood. And from within it came that same thin querulous fretting she had heard from the wind, a queenless lament with no center to it, and she straightened with a small grave shake of her head. 3 stocks, she judged, might be carrying yet, 2 queenless and failing, that a fresh mother or a timely union might save if she were quick, and 1 weak but whole that wanted only feeding and a kind month. And all the rest of that long thatched row stood empty, robbed, or starved, or swarmed away masterless into the woods in the season when no hand had been there to hive them. It was a wreck, but it was not a total wreck, and to a keeper that is the whole difference in the world. Well, she said aloud, very quietly, to the cat, and the dead skep, and the unanswering air, we shall see what can be saved. And it was the first promise she made at Beholt, made not to a man nor to a memory, but to a row of straw hives, and she meant to keep it. She was a long while in the garden, longer than was strictly civil to the 2 servants waiting at the door, walking the bank end to end and counting the stocks and laying her hand to each in turn, and learning by the touch and the sound which were beyond all help and which might yet, with a bought swarm and a kind autumn and a careful hand, be coaxed back to life. The sun had dropped behind the western wall, and the swifts were screaming high over the orchard, before she at last latched the oak door behind her and came back up the gravel to where Mrs. Tranter still stood, and there were apologies on the housekeeper's tongue, and a dish of tea growing cold within, and Theodosia met it all with her unhurried courtesy, and let herself be taken in. The hall was cool and dim and smelled of beeswax, and wood smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of an old house long and carefully kept. Mrs. Tranter named over the rooms as they went, and the keys at her waist, and the matter of the late mistress's affairs, as much as a housekeeper might. Mr. Wren put his head in to say the home farm was sound, and the consols, he understood, safe with Mr. Pike at Hereford, and that he was her servant in whatever she should want. Theodosia thanked them both, and said the right small things, and drank her tea, and turned over in her mind, beneath the surface of all this kindness, the broken hum of the bank, and the work that lay before her there. It was as she rose at last to be shown up to her chamber that Mrs. Tranter, with a small frown of recollection, drew from the pocket of her apron a square of pasteboard, and held it out. "I had near forgot, ma'am, with all the day's business. This was left at the south door not 3 days since, by a man come on horseback, who would not give his name to me, only to the master of the house, he said, and would not be told there was no master nor mistress, neither till you came. He set it in the door jamb, and rode off Worcester way." Theodosia took the card to the candle. It was a gentleman's calling card, good thick pasteboard a little soiled at one corner from the door, and engraved upon it in a flourishing hand was a name she had never in her life heard spoken, Sir Cuthbert Voyle, and beneath it a Worcester direction, and across the foot of it, scrawled in ink gone slightly furred where the damp of the door had caught it, ran a single line in a hasty private hand. She turned it to the light, and read the line twice over. It said, "An interest in the estate, to be made good." Theodosia Marchmont stood very still in the dim hall with the cold tea behind her, and her bees grieving in the dark garden below the house, and looked at the unknown name and the unfinished threat in the curl of the candle flame, and felt the held breath gather again behind her ribs, for she had come west thinking the only question at Beholt was whether anything could be saved upon the Bee Bank, and here in her hand was a second question she had not bargained for. Left waiting at her own south door before ever she crossed the threshold, who was Sir Cuthbert Voyle of Worcester, and what interest did a stranger imagine he held in a dead woman's bees? The card lay all night on the hall table where Mrs. Edith Tranter had set it, and in the morning Theodosia took it up again before she took up anything else. She had slept little. A strange bed in a strange house above an unfamiliar river will keep a tired woman from rest, and there had been the river itself, the lug muttering over its shallows below the orchard. A sound she did not yet know how to ignore. But the wakefulness had not troubled her. She had lain in the godmother's own chamber, under a tester hung with faded cruel work bees, and listened to the house settle, and thought, with the part of her mind that thought best in the dark, about the queenless quiet she had heard at the bee bank the evening before, and about the primrose-colored name written on the card the housekeeper had been unable to explain. Sir Cuthbert Voyle, of Worcester. An interest in the estate. She turned the card once between two fingers, as one turns a leaf to read the underside of it, and then she set it down and asked Mrs. Tranter for the keys. There were a great many keys, and the housekeeper knew every one of them, and named them as she passed each into Theodosia's hand, with the air of a woman surrendering a kingdom she had governed alone too long. The cellar, the still room, the linen press, the plate chest, which held little enough plate, the garden door in the south wall, and last, smallest, worn smooth and bright at the bow where a thumb had rubbed it 30 years, the key of the honey house. She carried that one on her own person, madam, said Mrs. Tranter, and not on the ring. Hung on a ribbon at her waist, summer and winter, and was buried with the ribbon but not the key. She left word the key was to go to whoever came after. Theodosia closed her hand on it and felt the warmth the housekeeper's palm had left, and something in her that had been composed since Tewkesbury, since the carrier's letter, since the slow chaise over the Malverns, moved a little, the way a hive moves when you lay your ear to it and find it is not dead after all, but only sleeping. The honey house stood at the foot of the walled garden, a low building of the same brick and timber as the manor, with a slate roof gone green on its north slope and a stone sill at the door where, that morning, the old tabby Bramble lay folded into himself in a square of early sun and declined to move for her. She stepped over him. Inside the air was cool and dim and smelt of three things at once, of wax, and of the ghost of honey, and of the particular dry sweetness of old paper, and Theodosia stood a moment in the doorway letting her eyes find the shapes of the room. Settling tubs along one wall, a row of empty jars on a shelf, washed and bright, and waiting. A great iron honey press in the corner, its screw furred with the dust of a season's neglect, skeps stacked crown down to keep the moth out, and on a deal table beneath the single small window, weighted flat by a smooth gray river stone, a ledger bound in worn calf the color of a dark comb. She knew it for what it was before she had crossed the floor to it. She lifted the river stone aside and opened the cover, and there on the first leaf, in a slanting brown hand grown spidery toward the end of the long entries, but firm and clear at the beginning, she read the line that made the whole strange inheritance suddenly and entirely real to her, a book of the bees at Bee Holt. Begun this Lady Day 1788 by Sabina Loder, widow, who means to keep a true account. Theodosia drew the one stool to the table and sat, and did not rise again for the better part of an hour, while in the square of sun upon the sill the cat slept, and the morning went on without her. It was, she saw at once, not a household book, nor an account of receipts and expenses, though money came into it. It was the record of a mind that had kept bees the way she herself kept them, by attention. Swarm dates ran down the margins year upon year, each with its weather noted beside it, a fine still morning, a thundery afternoon that sent them up cross and high into the great pear. Hive weights in spring and autumn, the heavy stocks marked to keep and the light ones marked to feed. The driving of bees from skep to skep at the back end so the stocks need not be smothered over the brimstone pit, a practice Mrs. Loder had set down with a small fierce note beside it in the year 1791. I will not burn my bees to get their honey, let who will call it waste, that made Theodosia smile down at the page as though she had met, across 30 years and the grave, a woman she had been waiting all her life to be introduced to. Frost notes, floods, when the lug came up over the lower orchard, the deaths of queens and the making of new. She turned the leaves slowly, reading not as one reads a document, but as the curate she had not yet met would have read his psalter, for the steadying of the mind and the ordering of the day, and when at last she closed it, she sat with her hand flat upon the cover a moment, as one does upon the hand of a friend. She carried the ledger up to the south parlor, and there she kept it, on the small table by the chimney where the morning light fell best, and Mrs. Tranter, finding it there that afternoon, said only, "She kept it in the honey house, madam," and Theodosia said, "I shall keep it where I can read it," and the housekeeper inclined her iron-gray head under its linen cap, as though a small but settled point of the new order had been established between them, which it had. That Sunday she walked down to St. Dubricius, the little church of grey stone under its yews at Marden under Croft, half a mile by the field path with Wenna Tranter, the housekeeper's daughter, going beside her to show the styles. The Reverend Owen Brace preached mildly, and at no great length on the lilies of the field, and afterward, he came out to her in the churchyard, with both hands a little ink-stained, and an eagerness in his manner that he seemed himself to find faintly embarrassing. He was 34, bookish, with spectacles that he pushed up his nose when he grew animated, which was often. He had known Mrs. Loder, he said, had sat with her over her last winter, had read to her when her eyes failed. She spoke of you, madam, he said, though I think she never named you. She said only that there was a girl who would understand the garden. I did not know whom she meant. I confess I am glad to find it is a person, and not, as I half feared, a figure of speech. And then, because he could not help it, because it was plainly the thing in all the world he most wished to discuss, he asked whether she had yet looked into the late lady's bee book, and whether it was true, as old Coram swore, that Mrs. Loder had never once smothered a stock in 40 years, and Theodosia, who had found in 3 days more conversation about bees than in 3 years at Mrs. Audley Pevensy's, said that it was quite true, and that she meant to keep the practice up, and watched the curate's mild face light as though she had told him the lilies of the field had been seen to bloom in January. Old Hesketh Coram she met 2 days after, when he came up to the Holt of his own accord, a man of 70 with hands like the roots of the pear trees, and a way of looking sidelong at a hive, before he would speak of it. He had made skeps for Bee Holt, he told her, since before the late lady's husband died, he had taught Mrs. Loder to drive bees, when she was a young widow, who knew nothing, and would not be told she knew nothing, and he had come, he said plainly, to see whether the new mistress was a fool, for he had buried one good beekeeper, and did not mean to stand by and watch a stranger ruin what was left. Theodosia took no offense at this. She took him down to the bee bank instead, and stood with him before the row of straw skeps, and the one new wooden octagon hive that Mrs. Loder had bought in her last year and never trusted, and she told him what she had heard in the hum 2 evenings before, that the 3rd skep from the wall was queenless and going light, and would need a frame of brood from a strong stock before the week was out, or it would dwindle to nothing. The old man looked at her sidelong a long moment, then he went and laid his own ear to the 3rd skep, and straightened, and said, "Aye," and from that moment, though he never said another word of it, Hesketh Coram was hers. So the days settled into something, and Theodosia, who had owned nothing of her own in 26 years, and had learned to be useful to other people's houses without ever once being mistress of a thing, began to feel the strange new shape of being mistress of this one, to feel it in the keys at her waist, in the ledger by the chimney, in the way Mrs. Tranter waited for her word, and Jago Wren the steward took off his hat to her in the yard, and the bees did not mind her hands. She did not let herself be foolish about it. She had been turned out of one settled place, already that year, by a woman who had smiled while she did it, and she knew how quickly the ground could open under a dependent woman's feet. But the ground here was hers, deeded and sealed, and she had begun, in the privacy of the godmother's chamber under the cruel work bees, to believe it. It was into this, into the 3rd week, into the very afternoon she had set aside to go through the honey house properly and reckon what stores were left, that Sir Cuthbert Voyle came in person to the Holt. She heard the chaise on the gravel and came in from the garden with her sleeves still turned back and a smear of green on one wrist, and Mrs. Tranter met her in the passage with a face of stone, and the word that a gentleman was waiting in the south parlour, and would give no business but to herself. He had risen when she came in, and he made her a bow of such breadth and warmth that it filled the small room. A heavy man of 50, fleshy about the jaw, got up in a waistcoat of primrose and snuff and a deal of fobs, a quizzing glass on a black ribbon, which he raised to his eye to look at her, and then, as though her appearance had charmed him beyond the need of it, let fall again. "Miss Marchmont. My very dear Miss Marchmont. You will forgive an old friend of the family for coming upon you so, but I could not, in conscience, let you sit here a day longer in ignorance of how nearly our interests are bound." His eye, while the warmth poured out of his mouth, went round the room once, quickly, and came to rest, she saw, upon the ledger by the chimney, and went past it, and came back to her. She did not ask him to sit. She stood with her marred wrist held a little from her grey skirts, and said that she was not aware she had any friends of the family she had not met, and begged he would tell her his business. The warmth did not so much as flicker. It was, she would think afterward, the most instructive thing about him, that nothing she said could chill it. Because it was not warmth at all, but only the costume warmth wore. He had come, he said, in sorrow as much as in duty. He had loved the late Mrs. Loder, a remarkable woman, a most remarkable woman, taken too soon, and it grieved him to the heart that the disposing of her affairs should bring him into seeming opposition to so charming a young lady as her god-daughter, when nothing was further from his wishes than opposition. But facts were facts, and a man must stand upon his rights however little he relished the standing. The plain truth, which it gave him no pleasure to lay before her, was that her late godmother, some 4 years gone, in the year 14, being then much pressed, and much beholden to him for kindnesses he would not name, had executed a prior settlement, a deed, drawn and witnessed, and sealed, conveying to him the whole income of the apiary at B. Holt, the honey, the wax, the increase, all of it, in perpetuity. The house is yours, my dear, freely yours, and the land, and I rejoice in it for you. But the bees, he said, and here for the first time something showed through the warmth, a glint, gone as soon as seen. The bees, I am sorry to say, are mine. Theodosia heard this out without moving, her eyes resting on his face that moment longer than most people's eyes rested before she spoke. The trick of looking that no companion's place had ever scolded out of her. She thought of the third skep going light, and of the entry for 1791, I will not burn my bees, and of the smooth warm key that had hung at a dead woman's waist for 30 years, and had come to her, and she said, in a manner so untroubled, that it plainly disconcerted him more than any cry could have done, that she found his account very interesting, and that she should be glad to see the deed. That checked the warmth a half-second. He recovered it. The deed, he said, was in the keeping of his attorney, a Mr. Ferris Quibble, a careful young man, who would be happy to wait upon her with it at her convenience, together with the receipts that proved the thing had been acted upon, for it was no dead letter, this settlement, but a living arrangement, honey delivered and money paid, as the papers would show. He spread his ringed hands as though to display how little he wished any of it. He was sure they need not be enemies. He was sure a sensible young woman, alone in the world and unused to the management of an estate, would see the wisdom of an accommodation rather than the folly of a contest, which contests, he need hardly tell her, were ruinous dear and seldom went the way the weaker party hoped. You are very good to think of my interest, said Theodosia. Pray let your Mr. Quibble bring the deed, and the receipts, and welcome. I should particularly like to see the receipts. She let a small silence sit after that, and then she asked him, with the same untroubled civility, one question more, whether he himself kept bees, in Worcester. Sir Cuthbert Voyle blinked. He said that he did not, that he was no hand at such things, that it was, he believed, a tedious and a stinging business, fit for the lower sort, and for elderly ladies with a turn for the rustic. He laughed at his own wit. Theodosia did not. She only inclined her head as though he had told her something she had wished to know, which he had, and rang for Mrs. Tranter to see the gentleman to his chaise. When the wheels had gone down the drive and the dust had settled over the place where they had been, she went and stood a long while at the parlor window above the bee bank, where the late summer foragers came and went over the Perry pears, heavy laden, in the unhurried traffic of a thriving stock. And then she sat down at the small table by the chimney, drew a sheet of the godmother's own paper toward her, mended a pen, and wrote to Mr. Halloran Pike at his chambers in Hereford. She wrote that a Sir Cuthbert Voyle of Worcester had this day called upon her, claiming under a prior settlement of the year 1814 the entire income of the apiary, and proposing to support the claim with a deed, and with receipts for honey delivered and paid, that she did not believe a word of it, and that she would take it very kindly if Mr. Pike, who had known her godmother's affairs, would come to B. Holt at his earliest convenience, and be present when the gentleman's attorney produced his papers. She did not write that she was frightened, because she was not. She sanded the letter, and folded it, and sealed it with the godmother's seal, a skep and 3 bees, and gave it to Jago Wren to carry to the Hereford post that same evening, and then she took up the ledger from the table by the chimney, and carried it back into the lamplight, and turned, with a perfect and deliberate calm. To the leaves that recorded the winters, looking, though she said nothing of it yet to any living soul, for the year 14. Mr. Halloran Pike came up from Hereford on the Thursday, 2 days after her letter reached his chambers, and he came by the early coach, rather than wait upon the carrier, which told Theodosia more about his reading of the matter than any line he might have written. She watched the chaise turn in at the lane from the south parlour window, where Bramble lay along the warm sill in a bar of forenoon light, and she saw the old solicitor hand himself down with the care of a man whose knees had spent 33 years bent to a desk. He had brought a black tin document box under his arm and a second clerk's satchel that Mrs. Edith Tranter took from him at the door with both hands, as though it weighed more than its leather warranted. Theodosia received him in the south parlour, and did not offer him sherry until he had sat, because she had learned in service that a man brought a long way will hear an offer of refreshment as a request to hurry, and she had no wish to hurry Mr. Pike. He set the tin box on the green baize card table that had become, in these weeks, the table at which the business of the Holt was done, and he folded his gold-rimmed spectacles up onto his brow, and looked at her with the frank, tired attention of a man taking the measure of a client he had inherited rather than chosen. "You wrote that a gentleman has laid claim to the apiary's income," he said. "You wrote it as plainly as if you were reporting the price of Perry pears. I confess I read it twice to be certain you had grasped the gravity, and then a third time, and concluded that you had grasped it better than I should have done in your place. Tell me the man." "Sir Cuthbert Voyle, of Worcester," she answered. "Fleshy, 50 or thereabouts. Fond of a primrose waistcoat and a quizzing glass on a black ribbon, and fonder still of the sound of his own warmth. He says my godmother deeded the apiary's whole yield to him by a settlement of 1814. He came in person to say it, smiling, and promised his attorney would bring the deed and a receipt to prove the thing already done and the honey already his. He gave me to understand the visit was a courtesy, that I might compose myself before the law made the matter disagreeable." Pike's mouth thinned. A settlement of 1814, of which no copy was lodged with Mrs. Loder's papers, nor with this office, nor, I should wager my spectacles, with any office in the county. And a receipt. "They always bring a receipt," he added, almost to himself, drawing the spectacles down again. "A deed may be argued over for a 12-month, a receipt looks like a fact. It is the receipt I should like to see soonest, for the receipt is where such men overreach. Have you fixed a day?" "Tomorrow," said Theodosia. "I sent word to Worcester that you would be here, and Sir Cuthbert replied within the hour." Which I thought told its own tale. A man with right on his side does not answer so quick, he keeps you waiting to show he is not anxious. Sir Cuthbert is anxious. He will come at 11, and bring Mr. Ferris Quibble, who is his attorney and, by the look of him when he stood in my doorway, not entirely easy in his master's harness. "You have eyes," Pike said, and it was not flattery, it was the grudging note of an old practitioner finding the apprentice has already done half his thinking for him. "Then I shall stay the night, with your housekeeper's leave, and we will receive them together. Say nothing of strategy to me now. I would rather watch the documents and form my view than be told what to look for and find it, whether it is there or not." So they waited, and the waiting was the worst of it, as waiting always is, but Theodosia did not pace, and she did not lie wakeful turning the thing over, for she had long ago made a private discipline of the night, and would not surrender it to Sir Cuthbert Voyle. She rose at her usual hour, took her usual turn down the dewed garden to the bee bank, stood a while before the row of straw skeps and the one new wooden octagon hive and listened, ungloved hands loose at her sides, to the low steady note the stocks made in the cool of the morning, a sound she trusted more than she trusted any deed in any tin box. The bees told her what the bees always told her, which was the truth of their own condition, and nothing of Sir Cuthbert, but the standing there steadied her, and she went in to breakfast with her colour even and her appetite unspoiled, which Mrs. Tranter remarked upon to her daughter Wenna in the kitchen, as a marvel and a comfort both. Sir Cuthbert Voyle arrived at 11:15, late by enough to be a small rudeness, and not by enough to be an open one, in a hired gig with Mr. Quibble beside him clutching a leather case to his chest. He came into the south parlour on a tide of his own talk. What a charming aspect the Holt had from the lane, What a pity poor Mrs. Slaughter had not lived to see the Perry pears in fruit. What a melancholy business it was that two persons of sense should be put to law over so trifling a matter as a few jars of honey, when surely an arrangement might be reached between friends. He had a way of saying friends that laid a small cold weight on the word. Theodosia let him talk himself to the end of it, as one lets a kettle come off the boil. And when he had at last lowered himself into the chair she indicated, and arranged the skirts of the primrose waistcoat over his stomach, she said only, "You will know Mr. Pike, of Hereford, who has charge of the estate's affairs. He has come to see your proof, Sir Cuthbert. Pray let us look at it, and not at the Perry pears." The smile did not leave Voil's face, but it altered, the way a pond alters when the wind drops and you can no longer be sure how deep it is. "Mr. Quibble," he said, "the documents." Mr. Ferris Quibble rose, set his leather case on the green baize table, and drew from it, with fingers that were not quite steady, two papers. The first he laid out flat and smoothed with the side of his hand, a settlement, written in a clerk's good round hand on a single broad sheet, dated the 11th of October 1814, reciting that Sapina Loder, widow, of Beholt in the county of Hereford, in consideration of natural love and certain moneys advanced, did grant and assign unto Sir Cuthbert Voile, Baronet, of the city of Worcester, the whole income, profit and increase of the apiary at Beholt, its skeps, stocks and swarms, together with all honey, wax and produce thereof, to have and to hold from the date thereof. At the foot was a signature, Sabina Loder, and a wax seal, and two witnesses whose names Theodosia did not know. It was, she saw, a handsome document. It looked like a fact. "And this," said Voile, with the air of a man laying down the winning card, "is the receipt. The proof, Mr. Pike, that the arrangement was no dead letter but a living one, acted upon, honored in the doing. Read it for yourself." Quibble laid the second paper beside the first. It was smaller, a half sheet, and it bore in the same clerk's hand a memorandum of delivery, received at Beholt this Lady Day, the 25th of March 1815, of Mrs. Loder's apiary, 400 weight of honey, well conditioned in the comb and run, for the account of Sir Cuthbert Voile, Baronet, the same being the first year's yield under the settlement aforesaid. A signature beneath, a carrier's mark, a sum of money noted in a margin. 400 weight. 400 weight of Beholt honey, delivered upon the quarter day, and the apiary's whole produce thereby shown to be Sir Cuthbert's by deed, and by deed performed. Theodosia looked at the receipt for a longer moment than she looked at anything, the level gray-green eyes resting on the paper before she spoke, and Pike, watching her and not the documents, saw that she had gone very still in the particular way she had. Not the stillness of a woman at a loss, but the stillness of a woman who has heard a wrong note in a piece of music she knows by heart, and is waiting, courteous, for the player to reach the end of the bar. The room, for a moment, half believed it. That was the bitter thing, she felt it move through the parlor like a draught. Even Pike had drawn the receipt towards him with a frown that was, for the space of 3 breaths, a frown of concern and not of suspicion, for the paper was plausible, the hand consistent, the seal sound. The carrier's mark such as a carrier might make. Sir Cuthbert felt it too, and leaned back, and let his thumbs find the armholes of the primrose waistcoat. "You see how it is," he said comfortably. "A melancholy business. 400 weight is no small matter, at the prices of the year it came to a pretty sum, and I have had none of it since, the lady's death having thrown all into confusion. I do not seek to distress Miss Marchmont, I seek only what is owing, and what the paper shows was already mine the very spring, after the deed was signed." Theodosia let the silence sit a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she lifted her eyes from the receipt and asked, in the same even voice with which she had declined to discuss the Perry pears, a question that seemed for a heartbeat to have nothing to do with the matter at all. "Sir Cuthbert, Mr. Quibble, does anyone in this room keep bees?" The two men looked at her, and then at each other, with the blank and faintly affronted certainty of gentlemen asked whether they can milk a cow. "I confess the husbandry of the things is not my study," Voile said, recovering his smile. "I am a man of business, Miss Marchmont, not a cottager. Why should I keep bees, when I have a deed to their increase?" "No reason in the world," she said. "I only wished to be sure I understood you rightly. You are content, Then, both of you, to swear that 400 weight of honey came off this bank in the spring of 1815, and was carried to your account, Sir Cuthbert, on Lady Day of that year. The paper swears it, said Voyle. I have only to produce the paper. Then, I think, said Theodosia, we had better produce the other paper, that we may set the two side by side and let them agree or disagree as they will. She did not say which paper she meant, and she did not reach for it, and she did not let the smallest gleam of what she knew show in her face, for she had resolved, in the cool of that morning before the skeps, that she would not spring the thing across a card table in a temper, where a clever man might bluster and a forged receipt might be whisked back into a leather case, and the whole afternoon dissolve into the word of a lady against the word of a baronet. She wanted witnesses, she wanted the curate, who could swear to a hand. She wanted old Hesketh Coram, who had been bee-man at the Holt these 50 years, and could swear to a season. She wanted the thing done properly, in daylight, with the right people in the room, so that when it broke it could not be mended. So she turned to Mr. Pike and said, plainly, Sir, I should be obliged if we did not conclude this today. The receipt speaks of the apiary's yield in the spring of 1815, and there is a record of that yield, my godmother's own apiary ledger, kept in her hand in the honey house, where she set down every swarm, every weighing, every pound of honey drawn, and every hard winter for 30 years. It is only just to Sir Cuthbert, as well as to the estate, that his receipt and her ledger be read together. I would not have it said that I doubted his paper on my bare word. Let the ledger be fetched. And let 2 men be present who can speak to it, the Reverend Owen Brace, the curate, who knew my godmother's hand, and Hesketh Coram, the bee-man, who knew her bees. They cannot all come within the hour. Let us meet tomorrow morning, here, at this table, and read the records together. It was so reasonable a request, so scrupulous toward his own client's interest, that Quibble murmured his assent before his master could weigh it, and having murmured it could hardly take it back. Voile's smile held, but a small line had come between his brows, and Theodosia, who read hives by the alteration of a hum, read that line and was satisfied. He had expected tears, or terms, or a frightened lady's offer of a sum to be rid of him. He had not expected to be invited, with every courtesy, to wait one more day and watch a ledger opened. A man wholly sure of his paper would have welcomed it. Sir Cuthbert Voyle agreed to it, as a man agrees to a thing he cannot decently refuse, and Theodosia marked that too. Tomorrow, then, said Pike, rising, and there was a new spring in the old solicitor's manner, the manner of a man who has caught the scent of his quarry, and means to run it down by the book. At 11, gentlemen, and pray be punctual. The lady keeps country hours, and so, I find, do I. He saw them to the door himself, the tin box left behind on the green baize, and when the hired gig had gone down the lane he came back into the parlor, and looked at Theodosia with something that was very near to delight. You did not show your hand, he said. I watched for it. You held a card and you did not show it. May an old man ask what is in that ledger? The winter, said Theodosia simply. But you shall read it tomorrow with the rest, Mr. Pike, and I would rather you read it cold, as you bade me say nothing to you last night. Will you send Wenna to me? I must write 3 notes, to the curate, to Coram, and to Mr. Wren, to ask that the ledger be carried up from the honey house and laid ready. The notes were written, and went out by hand within the half-hour, Wenna Tranter taking the path across the home farm to find the bee-man, and the curate's note going down to the parsonage at St. Dubricius, with the steward's boy. And in the long gold of the late afternoon, before the family sat to a quiet supper that no one had much appetite for, and everyone pretended to, Mr. Jago Wren came up himself from the honey house, his weather-creased hands careful as a churchwarden's about a font, bearing the apiary ledger, a thick, swollen volume bound in calf gone soft and brown with handling, its spine cracked white at the joints, its edges furred where 30 years of fingers had turned them. He set it down on the green baize table where Sir Cuthbert's tin box still stood, and Theodosia did not open it. She let it lie there, closed, its cover a little raised at the foredge where the damp of the honey house had got into the paper and swelled it. The late light lying across the worn calf, and warming it to the color of the thing it kept the record of. Bramble came in from the parlor window, and considered the book, and declined to sit upon it, and went instead to the warm patch where the sun had been. The ledger lay unopened on the green baize, and in it, set down in Sabina Loder's own steady hand on a page no one in that room had yet turned to, was the answer to a receipt for 400 weight of honey from a spring in which there had been no honey at all, and they left it lying so, and went into supper, and waited for the morning. Morning came to Beholt grey and still, with a thin March's mist lying along the lug, and the perry pears dripping in the orchard, and by 9 o'clock the south parlour had filled with the men who would settle the matter. Mrs. Edith Tranter had laid the fire early, and set the green baize table square to the window, and upon it, where it had been carried in the night before, lay the apiary ledger of Mrs. Sabina Loder, a thick volume bound in calf gone soft at the corners, its clasp unlatched, its cover closed. Theodosia Marchmont had not opened it. She had wished it to be opened here, before witnesses, by daylight, so that no man in the room could afterward say the thing had been done in a corner. She sat at the head of the baize in her dove-grey stuff gown, the single jet brooch at her throat, her ungloved hands folded upon the table's edge, her grey-green eyes resting on the closed book a moment longer than another woman's might have, and then lifting to the company. Mr. Halloran Pike had come over from Hereford the previous evening and lodged at the parsonage. He sat at her right, with his gold-rimmed spectacles pushed up and a fresh quill laid ready, 33 years of other people's quarrels having taught him to wait. Beside the hearth, turning his hat in his hands, stood old Hesketh Coram, the bee-man, 70 years old, and bent like a hazel stake, who had walked up from his cottage at first light and would not take the offered chair. The Reverend Owen Brace, curate of St. Dubricius, mild and bookish, had set himself near the window with a borrowed prayer book on his knee as though he had wandered in by accident, though it was Theodosia who had asked him to come. And across the baize, with the light full on him and his attorney a half-pace behind, sat Sir Cuthbert Voyle. He had dressed for triumph. The primrose and snuff waistcoat strained at its buttons, the quizzing glass swung on its black ribbon, and a fine dew of snuff lay in the creases of his fleshy jaw. Upon the table before him, squared as carefully as a man squares a winning card, lay the two papers that were the whole of his cause, the so-called prior settlement of 1814, by which Mrs. Loder was said to have deeded the apiary's income to him, and beneath it the receipt, the keystone, as he plainly believed it, for 400 weight of Beholt honey delivered at Lady Day, in the spring of 1815. Mr. Ferris Quibell, his attorney, young and ill at ease in a coat a season behind the fashion, held a second copy, and would not quite meet anyone's eye. "I am glad," Sir Cuthbert began, with the rich warmth he wore as another man wears a great coat, "that Miss Marchmont has seen the wisdom of gathering us, for it spares us all the tedium of the bench. The settlement speaks for itself. My late friend Mrs. Loder, a most particular woman, as her hand will show, conveyed to me the income of this apiary in the year 14, and the receipt before you proves the yield was drawn, and delivered the spring following. 400 weight, ma'am. A handsome flow. The honey was mine before ever you crossed the Malverns." He spread his thick fingers upon the papers, and smiled at her, as one smiles at a child who has been allowed to sit up past her hour. "I do not doubt your solicitor will counsel you to a quiet composition. There need be no unpleasantness." "There need be none," Theodosia said. Her voice was even, low, unhurried. "Sir Cuthbert, before I open my godmother's book, I should like to ask the room a question I asked yesterday, and was not answered. Is there any gentleman here who keeps bees?" The silence had a different quality than the silence before. Sir Cuthbert's smile did not move, but something behind it shifted, as a man shifts his weight on uncertain ground. "I fail to see," he said, "what the keeping of bees has to do with a deed of conveyance." "You will see," she said. "Mr. Quibble, you drew the receipt fair. Have you ever stood at a hive?" The young attorney colored to his collar. "I know, ma'am. I have not." "Mr. Pike?" "I confess I have not, Miss Marchmont," said the old solicitor, "though I begin to suspect I am about to be instructed." "Then there is one man in this room who has," Theodosia said, and turned her grey-green eyes to the bent figure by the hearth. "Mr. Coram has kept the bees of this bank for 60 years, and taught my godmother her craft, and there is the ledger, which is the bees' own account of themselves, kept 30 years in Mrs. Loder's hand. Between the two of them, sir, I think the spring of 1815 will speak for itself far better than I can speak for it." She drew the volume to her, unlatched nothing further, and opened it. The pages were close written, brown ink faded to the color of old honey, ruled into columns down which the years marched in a small upright hand, dates of swarms cast, weights of skeps taken up, pounds of honey drawn, notes of weather, notes of dearth. She did not hunt. She had spent 4 evenings with this book by candlelight, and she went to the place as a woman goes to a verse she has by heart. Turning back through the summer of 1815, through the spring, to the leaves that carried the winter before, the winter of 1814 into 1815, and there she stopped, and laid her ungloved hand flat upon the page so that all might see she added nothing and hid nothing. "I will read you my godmother's own words," she said, as she set them down. November, 1814. Hard frost come early, the bank white by Martin Moss, the stocks light, fed the 4 skeps with sugar and ale, doubting it will serve. December. Frost holds. The river froze at the ford, which Coram says he has not seen these 40 years. Wrap the skeps in straw, the bees do not stir. She turned the leaf. January, 15, the great cold. 2 skeps silent, I lifted them, and they weighed as nothing, the stalks dead, and the comb empty, the bees fallen in a drift at the floor. And, February. Her voice did not rise, it was the steadier for being low. The last 2 gone. Every colony on the bank is dead. There is no living bee at Bee Holt this day. Coram and I burned the foul skeps for fear of the moth, and I have wept over it. Being too old to weep over much, we will buy a swarm in the summer, and begin again, if God spares us a kind one. She let the words settle into the green bay's quiet. Somewhere in the orchard a wood pigeon called, and was still. There were no bees at Bee Holt in the spring of 1815, Theodosia said. Not one. The hives were dead by February and burned, and the bank stood empty until June. I will show you June, sir, for it matters. She turned forward 2 leaves. June the 9th, 1815. Bought a single swarm of Coram's cousin at Bodenham, a good prime swarm of this year's casting, and hived it in the new octagon. The bank lives again, though we are 30 years set back in a season. 1 swarm, sir, have it in June. And you have laid upon this table a receipt for 400 weight of honey from this apiary, drawn and delivered at Lady Day, which is the 25th of March, in that same spring. She lifted her hand from the page at last and folded it again with the other. Lady Day was 3 months before there was a living bee on the place. 400 weight is the labor of many strong stocks across a whole season's flow. Dead hives cannot fill jars, Sir Cuthbert. There was no honey at Bee Holt that spring. There could not have been. Your receipt is for goods that did not exist, delivered by bees that were ash in my godmother's fire grate. Sir Cuthbert Voil's face had gone the color of his own waistcoat. A book, he said, and the warmth had curdled out of his voice. A parcel of old wives' weather notes scrawled by a woman half in her dotage. You would set scribble against a witness deed? I would set the truth against a lie, she said, without heat, and let these gentlemen judge which is which. Mr. Coram, you have heard me read. Is it true? The old bee man came forward from the hearth at last, slow on his hazel stake legs, and he set 1 knotted brown finger on the page, as gently as he might have stroked a comb. He had not the letters to read it, and did not pretend to. He read the winter instead, out of his own 70 years. The frost of 14 into 15, Hesketh Coram said, in the flat soft burr of the marches, were the killing frost of my long life, and I have buried 2 wives and outlived my sons, so I have had time to learn the bad winters from the good. The lug froze at Marden Ford, which I never saw before nor since, and a man walked his dog across it on the Sunday. Every skep on this bank starved or froze afore Candlemas. Mistress Loder and me, we burned 'em ourselves out yonder by the wall. I can show the scorch on the bricks to this day. There were no bees here till I fetched up the Bodenham swarm in the June, and carried it on my own back in a straw cage, and a temper it had on it too. He lifted his finger from the page and looked, not at Sir Cuthbert, but at Theodosia, and something in the old face eased. A dead hive don't make honey, sir, a child of 3 knows that. There weren't a pound of Bee Holt honey to be had that Lady Day, let alone 400 weight. You might as easy ha' bought wool off a shorn dead sheep. And the hand? Theodosia asked, turning now to the curate at the window. Reverend Brace, you knew my godmother's writing. You buried her. Is this her hand throughout? The Reverend Owen Brace rose, set down his prayer book, and came to bend over the open ledger, pushing his spectacles up his nose in the very gesture Mr. Pike had used an hour before. He turned a leaf back and one forward, comparing the winter pages to the long calm columns of the years before and after, and he was some moments about it, for he was a careful man and knew what hung upon the answer. "It is her hand," he said quietly. "I have a dozen of her letters in the parsonage and a register she signed at every christening these 8 years, and I would swear to this hand before the bishop. It does not falter, it does not change pen, it does not break off where a forger's would break off to copy. These are entries set down day by day across 30 years, by one woman who never dreamed they would be read aloud in a court. No man living could counterfeit a lifetime so. It is true, Sir Cuthbert. The book is true." Now every eye in the room came round upon the 2 papers squared so carefully on the baize, and they had a poorer look than they had worn an hour before, as a conjurer's silk has a poorer look once the trick is shown. It was Mr. Pike who reached for the receipt, courteously, with a glance for leave at Quibble, who gave a small sick nod and held it up to the grey window light, and then drew from his waistcoat a little folding glass and bent his old eyes to the lower corner of the sheet. "Mr. Quibble," he said mildly, "you are a young man, and I think an honest one fallen into poor company, so I will ask you rather than tell you. Will you look at the watermark of this paper? Hold it to the light, there, where the chain lines run. You will find, I think, a maker's name, and beneath it a date." The young attorney took it with a hand that was not quite steady, and held it up, and the room watched the color leave his face, as the color had left his master's. The watermark stood out plain against the window, the device of a Maidstone paper mill, and woven into the laid lines beneath it, small but unmistakable, a year. 1817, Ferris Quibble said. He said it very low, but in that quiet it carried to every corner. The paper is watermarked 1817. It was not made until 2 years after the day the receipt is dated. He laid the sheet down upon the baize as a man lays down a card he wishes he had never been dealt, and he did not pick it up again. "Sir Cuthbert, I cannot stand to this. I told you I misliked it. The paper itself swears against the date, and I'll not put my name where the paper damns it. I am very sorry, ma'am, I drew it fair believing what I was told, and I was told a lie." He gathered his own copy, his hat, his pride such as was left him, and stepped back from the table to the wall, putting a clear yard of green baize between himself and his client. And there he stood with his eyes down. For a moment, Sir Cuthbert Voyle sat alone behind his ruined papers, with the morning light unkind upon him, the quizzing glass dangling, the snuff gone grey in the creases of his jaw, and he looked from the watermarked receipt to the open ledger to the still grey-green gaze of the young woman at the head of the table, and he understood that he had been beaten not by a marquis, nor a magistrate, nor any man at all, but by a book of weather notes and an old man's memory of a frozen ford, and a woman who knew, as he had never troubled to learn, that dead hives cannot fill jars. He made one last attempt at bluster, heaving himself up so that his chair barked back across the boards. This is a nest of yokels and a parcel of scribble, and I shall consult. You shall consult nothing," said Mr. Pike, and for the first time the old solicitor's voice had iron in it. "You shall withdraw your claim entire, sir, here and in writing, before you quit this room, and you shall account yourself fortunate that Miss Marchmont is a Christian woman, and the season is harvest. For I tell you plainly, a forged settlement and a fabricated receipt are not a matter of quiet composition. They are a matter of the assize, and the pillory and worse, and were my client of a mind to press it, you would not see Worcester again as a free man. Sit down. Take Mr. Quibble's pen, and write." And Sir Cuthbert Voyle, fleshy and florid, and emptied at last of every card he held, sat down. He wrote what Pike dictated, in a hand that wandered with the shaking of it. A clean renunciation of all claim and interest in B. Holt and its apiary, and all that pertained to it, and he signed it, and Quibble witnessed it with his face turned away, and the curate witnessed it after, and it was done before the parlor clock had struck the half. He did not stay to dine. By the time the mist had burned off the lug, and the Perry pears stood dripping in honest sunlight, his hired chaise was a diminishing rattle on the Leominster road, and the south parlor of B. Holt held only the quiet company of those who belonged to the place. Theodosia closed the ledger gently, and latched the clasp and laid both her ungloved hands flat upon the soft old calf of it, and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since November of 1814. "Well, ma'am," said Hesketh Coram, settling his hat at last upon his white head, "I reckon the bees won that one." And the Reverend Owen Brace laughed, and old Pike wiped his spectacles, and Mrs. Edith Tranter, who had been listening shamelessly at the door, came in to mend the fire, and to say that there was a seed cake, and that nobody was leaving Beholt hungry on such a morning. Not if she had the keeping of it. Sir Cuthbert Voiles' chaise was gone from the Marden Road by the morning after, and with it went a weight that Theodosia Marchmont had not fully measured until she felt it lifted. The honey house seemed lighter when she unlocked it that first untroubled day, the green baize table cleared of forged paper, the ledger restored to its proper shelf above the settling tank where it had lived for 30 years. Bramble the old tabby slept in his accustomed square of sun on the sill, indifferent to law and lineage alike. She stood a while in the doorway and let the place be hers without contest, and the bee bank below the wall hummed its low autumn note. The bought stock of June grown strong now, and the new wooden octagon hive heavy at the corner. The hard frost of 14 and 15 that had killed every colony and undone Voyle in a single quiet reading felt suddenly very far off. A winter survived, recorded, and turned at the last into the very proof of her right to stand here. Theodosia did not gloat over it. She had won, but the winning had a gravity to it. A near stranger had loved her enough to leave her this, and she meant to deserve the leaving. She set herself, in the weeks that followed, to belong. There is a way a newcomer may live in a parish like a lodger, paying her tithes and nodding at the light gate and remaining, after a 12-month, as foreign as the day she came. And there is the other way, the slower and the truer, and Theodosia chose the second, without ever quite resolving to. She went to St. Dubricius each Sunday, and took the pew that had been Mrs. Loder's, beneath the third window where the morning light fell green through old glass, and the Reverend Owen Brace, the mild bookish curate who had stood witness to the ledger and named the Godmother's hand for true, preached on at his even pace while she learned the faces of the congregation one by one. The home farm she walked with Mr. Jago Wren, the steward, weather-creased and plain-spoken, and 55, who had at first addressed her with the wary courtesy a man keeps for a mistress he expects to sell up within the year, and who thawed by slow degrees as he found her asking the right questions. Which of the pear trees flowered earliest, where the late clover lay? Whether the home meadow had been mown for hay or left for the bees? "You think of them first, ma'am," he said one afternoon by the orchard gate, not quite a compliment, and not quite not, and she answered that she supposed she always had, and he looked at her then as a man looks, who has revised an opinion and is the more comfortable for it. The school children she came to by the curate's contriving. The dame who had taught the parish infants their letters in the cold front room of a cottage near the ford, had grown too rheumatic to keep at it, and the Reverend Owen Brace, who had lent Theodosia his own thumbed volume of Gilbert White's letters, within a week of meeting her, proposed gently that the new mistress of Beholt might care to read to the children of a Thursday. She had no notion she would care for it, and found that she did. She read them White's account of the swallows, and the harvest mouse, and the tortoise that slept the winter under the laurel hedge. She read them, when they begged it, of the bees, and was delighted past her own composure when a snub-nosed boy of 7 asked her whether a queen could sting, and whether she herself had ever been stung. And she rolled back the cuff of her dove-gray gown, and showed them the faint roughened knuckles that no chaperone had ever scolded smooth, and said that she had, 100 times, and that it was a small price for the company she kept. They thought her wonderful for it. She thought them, in turn, a sweeter society than any she had known in a paid companion's place, where her use had been to fetch shawls and turn music and make herself agreeable. It was when a tranter who became her daily companion, and that without arrangement, the way the best companionships fall. Edith Tranter's daughter was 22, quick-fingered and quicker-eyed, with her mother's iron sense softened by youth. She had begun by carrying the honey house key, and ended by carrying half of Theodosia's hours. She read aloud of an evening in the south parlor, stumbling honestly over the Latin in white, and laughing at her own stumbling, and she walked the bee bank in the cool of the day learning, at Theodosia's elbow, to tell the contented hum of a hive from the fretful one, the queenright note from the queenless, "How do you know it, ma'am?" she asked once, "when they all of them sound the same to me?" And Theodosia, who had never had to put it into words before, said it was not unlike knowing a friend's mood by the pitch of her voice through a closed door. You did not reason it, you had simply heard it long enough. Wenna took to keeping a little tally of swarm talk in the back of the household book, in her round hand, and Theodosia, watching her do it, felt the first stirring of a notion that would grow. For the present, though, the largest of her days were given to Mrs. Loder's papers. The apiary's record she had read through twice already, scripture deep, but there remained the godmother's private papers. 3 deal boxes of them brought down from the muniment closet by Mrs. Edith Tranter, and set on the long table in the south parlor beneath the window. Theodosia had put off the sorting of them, half from the press of other things, and half from a delicacy she could not name. The going through of a dead woman's letters has something of the trespass in it, even when the dead woman has handed you the key. But the autumn drew in. The Perry pears bared their boughs. And on a wet still afternoon, with the fire drawing well and Wenna stitching by the hearth, she at last untied the first bundle. She had expected accounts. She found, at the top, accounts indeed, a fair copied book of household reckonings, a sheaf of receipts from the Hereford tradesmen, the dry sediment of a long careful widowhood. But beneath them, wrapped in a square of yellowed silk and tied with a faded ribbon that had once been green, lay a portrait miniature, and Theodosia's hands grew still upon it. It was the face of a woman perhaps 60, painted some years since by no great hand but a true one, a long humorous countenance, gray eyes set level and direct in a way that struck Theodosia with a small cold shock of familiarity, for she had seen the look before, lately, in her own glass. Iron gray hair under a plain lace cap and at the throat. Painted with a particularity that argued the sitter had insisted on it, a sprig of Perry pear blossom. On the reverse, in a hand she now knew as well as her own, was written, Sabina Loder, of B. Holt, in her 61st year. This was the godmother she had met but once, at 11, and whose face she had carried since only as a warmth and a blur. Here she was, fixed and watching, and Theodosia sat with the little oval in her palm, for a long time, and did not speak, and Wenna, glancing up, had the grace to say nothing either. Beneath the miniature lay the letters, and the letters were the thing. They were not letters Mrs. Loder had received, they were letters she had written and never sent, or had begun and laid aside. And others that were less letters than memoranda to herself. A private commonplace of the heart, set down across a dozen years, and tied together at the end as a single account. Theodosia read them through the failing afternoon, and Wenna lit the candles without being asked and set them at her elbow, and still she read. They were about herself. From the first of them, dated the autumn she had been 11, to the last, dated within the very 12-month of the godmother's death, Mrs. Sabina Loder had quietly followed the whole course of Theodosia Marchmont's life. The first entry told the thing the whole story had begun with, and that Theodosia had half forgotten she remembered. She had been brought, that one summer of her childhood, to B. Holt. Her mother had been Mrs. Loder's second cousin, and there had been some visit, some week of a wet March as August, the particulars lost. But the bees she had not lost. A stock had cast in the walled garden, a great hanging swarm gathered like dark fruit on a low bough of the Perry pear, and the bee-man, old Hesketh Coram, younger than by 20 years, had gone for his skep and his sheet, and the household had drawn back as households do, and an 11-year-old girl in a holland pinafore had walked up to the swarm unbidden and put her bare hands beneath it. I called to her to come away, Mrs. Loder had written, and she did not, and I saw she was not deaf to me, but only that she had heard something nearer and more interesting. She gathered them down into Coram's skep with her 2 hands as easy as gathering windfalls, and not a sting on her, and asked me, grave as a justice, why the bees had left their house. I have kept that question by me 11 years. I write this to remember that somewhere in my line there is a girl who is not afraid of the right things. Theodosia read it twice, and found her sight had blurred, which she permitted herself, briefly, by the candle. The entries went on. Mrs. Loder had asked after her, year upon year, through whatever thin channel of cousinage remained. Had learned of the Reverend Josiah Marchmont's death and his slender estate, of the daughter gone out to earn her bread as a companion, of the place with Mrs. Audley Pevensey, and, at the last, of the dismissal. She is turned off, one of the final entries ran, the daughter married and the companion no longer wanted, and I am told she bore it without complaint, which I do not wonder at. I have watched this child become a woman these 15 years at the length of other people's gossip, and never once brought myself to write to her, for what should I say, that I have loved a stranger for the way she held her hands beneath a swarm? She would think me mad. But I am old now, and the bees are mine to leave, and there is no one of my own blood I would trust them to. I shall leave them to her. Let Pike find her. She is the only soul I ever met, kin or stranger, who thought first of the bees and last of herself. So, it had not been chance. It had never been chance. The whole of it, the will, the Holt, the consols, the acres, the long brick house above the lug, and the bee bank beneath its garden wall, had been the deliberate gift of a woman who had chosen her across the silence of 15 years for a single thing she had done at 11, and never thought of since. Theodosia had come to Herefordshire believing herself the accidental beneficiary of a relation's want of any nearer claim, a convenience, a name that happened to be on a faded list. She set the letters down and understood that she had been, instead, the most particular choice of a particular woman's life, that the swarm she had calmed in this very garden, on a bough not 40 yards from where she now sat, had been the seed of everything, and that the painted scene she had carried so long as a warm childhood blur had been, to the watching godmother, the founding text of a 15-year love. It might have been a grief, and it was not. That was the strange grace of it. Theodosia had braced, going into the boxes, for some old family wound to open. A quarrel, a disinheritance, the cold machinery of who had wronged whom. She found instead only the record of a constancy. There was no trauma in it to be salved, no estrangement to be reconciled. There was simply a woman who had loved her quietly, and at a distance, and had said so, at the very last, in the most enduring language she possessed, a deed, a bee bank, a ledger 30 years deep. To be loved that way, unsuspecting, across so long a silence, was a thing Theodosia did not know how to hold without her composure giving a little at the edges, and she let it give, there in the candlelight, while when a tranter pretended very hard to be wholly occupied with her stitching, and was not. She knew you then, Wenna said at length, softly. When the worst of it had passed and Theodosia had wiped her eyes once, plainly, without performance. All that while, she knew me better than I knew myself, Theodosia answered. She knew the one thing about me that was ever entirely my own. And she looked up at the chimney breast above the south parlor hearth, where the wall was bare, and resolved on the instant that the miniature should hang there. Sabina Loder restored to her own parlor, her level gray eyes set toward the door, and the bee bank beyond it, watching still. Mrs. Edith Tranter found a place for it within the week, and a frame, and when it was up the housekeeper stood back and said only, "There, that's the house put right," and went away with her keys. And Theodosia understood she had been given another kind of approval, the parish kind, slow and dry and worth a great deal more for the slowness. The letters changed nothing in the deed, and everything in the keeping of it. Theodosia had meant, before, to keep the apiary well, as a steward keeps a thing entrusted. She meant now to keep it as a daughter keeps a trust, a deeper office. And out of that, in the same wet week, came the notion that Wenna's little tally of swarm talk had first stirred. The ledger above the settling tank ran 30 years and stopped. Mrs. Loder's last entry, the bought swarm of June 1815, the rebuilding after the killing frost, then a few thin lines tapering into the failing hand of an old woman's final seasons, sat at the foot of the last filled page. And beyond it the book was blank. It had been, in Voil's hands, a weapon, and to the curate a witness, but it was first and oldest a record kept by one keeper of bees, so that the next might read the seasons and not be caught out by them. And there was a next keeper, sitting in the south parlor, with the dead woman's letters in her lap, and the dead woman's face newly hung above the hearth. So Theodosia began her own bee book. She did not begin it in the old ledger, that she would keep whole and sacred, Mrs. Loder's 30 years left to stand entire, the frost of 14 and 15 in all. She had Wren fetch her a new book from Hereford, of the same long narrow shape and the same plain marbled boards, and on the first leaf she wrote. In a hand she set herself to make as clear as the godmother's, the bee book of B. Holt, continued. Theodosia Marchmont, her hand, in the autumn of the year 1818. And beneath it, for the first entry, she set down what she had read by ear on her very first morning at the bank, and carried unwritten ever since, the queenless quiet of the old stocks, the strength of the June swarm, the weight of the new octagon hive going up to winter, the late pear blossom, and the heather flow she meant to take honestly, by driving the bees and not destroying them, when the autumn turned. When it copied her tally of hum-talk fair onto the second page, blushing at the honor of it, and Coram, when Theodosia walked up to his cottage to tell him of it, nodded his 70-year-old head and said Mistress Loder would be glad of it past speaking. For she had always grieved that a record dies with its keeper unless another hand takes it up, and he showed her, that same afternoon, the right set of the new skeps for a hard winter, the very lesson he had given the godmother 40 years before, so that the teaching too was continued and not let fall. The trait that had won her the house was no longer merely a defense against forgers. It had become a vocation, taken up and handed on, a thread drawn unbroken from an 11-year-old's bare hands through 30 years of a stranger's love to the new book open on the south parlor table, and Theodosia Marchmont, sitting at it of an evening with the firelight on Sabina Loder's painted face, knew herself for the first time not the convenient appendage of some other household, but the mistress of her own, the keeper of the bees of B. Holt, the writer of their record, the inheritor not of an accident, but of a choice. The autumn deepened toward the heather flow, and the harvest she meant to take her own way, and word of how the new mistress meant to take it was already beginning, very quietly, to travel the parish and beyond it. West across the lug toward a grave courteous house she had not yet heard named. September came down the Lug Valley, in a long golden weather, that the old people at Marden Undercroft said they had not seen the equal of in 20 years, and it found the bee bank at B. Holt in the fullest health it had known since Sabina Loder kept it. Theodosia walked the row each morning before the dew had lifted, her bare hands folded into the dove-gray shawl against the early chill, and she could read the season in the very pitch of the bank, a deep, even, contented note that ran from the first straw skep at the orchard end to the new wooden octagon hive that stood a little apart, like a stranger lately made welcome. Afterward, at the small table in the honey house with Bramble the old tabby asleep on the sill, she set down what the morning had told her in the bee book she had begun in the late summer. Her own hand carried on past the last of her godmothers, the same column of dates and weights and weathers continued without a break, so that a stranger turning the pages would not have known where the dead woman's keeping ended and the living woman's began. The pears had blossomed late and lavishly that summer, and after them the lime walk by the church, and now the last and richest flow of all was on, for the heather had purpled the common land above the Holt, and the foragers came home heavy with it, their legs gold-dusted, their hum at the entrances thickened to that drowsy, freighted sound she had learned at 11 and never forgotten. She had 3 new stocks where in June there had been the bought swarm, and 2, she had drawn frames of combs so pale and so fragrant that Mrs. Edith Tranter, lifting one to the kitchen light, had said it looked like a pane of church glass with the sun behind it. The colonies that the savage frost of 1814 had killed to the last bee were forgotten now, except in the ledger. The bank had answered Theodosia's hand as the bank had once answered her godmother's, and she did not pretend, even to herself, that the answering gave her no joy. It was the manner of the harvest that set the parish talking. The custom on the marches, as everywhere that bees were kept for the pot and not for the pleasure, was the brimstone pit at Michaelmas, the heaviest skeps chosen, the doomed colonies set over a sunken trough where rags soaked in burning brimstone smoked them dead in their thousands, and the comb cut from the corpses of the very stock that had made it. Hesketh Coram, the old bee-man who had taught Mrs. Loder her craft, and was now 70 and bent as a reaping hook, had taken the brimstone for 60 autumns, and thought no more of it than of wringing a hen's neck. It was how honey was got, and it had always been how honey was got, and a man did not argue with Michaelmas. Theodosia argued with Michaelmas. She had read, in the godmother's hand, and in the slim volume of the Reverend Gilbert White's letters that the curate had lent her, of the driving of bees, of turning the laden skep mouth upward, fitting an empty one above it, and drumming patiently on the sides with 2 sticks until the whole colony, queen and all, marched up into the new house, and was spared to winter and to work another year. It was slower. It was, Coram said flatly, A deal of trouble for a thing that brimstone settled in a quarter of an hour. Theodosia heard him out, level gray-green eyes resting on him a moment longer than answered him, and then said that she would drive her bees, or she would not harvest them, and that the trouble was hers to take. She took it on a still afternoon in the last week of September, with Coram standing by in frank disbelief, when a tranter watching from the orchard gate with her apron pressed to her mouth, and Mr. Jago Wren the steward leaning on the wall, as though he expected to carry someone to the house stung blind. Theodosia knelt at the heaviest of the straw skeps, the one whose weight she had judged by lifting it a thumb's breadth from the stand and feeling the drag of full calm. She turned it over with the unhurried care of a woman riding a sleeping child, set the empty skep mouth to mouth above it, bound the join with a strip of linen, and began to drum, a soft, insistent, double-handed tattoo low on the straw, neither fast nor slow. The rhythm of a thing that means to go on as long as it must. The note within rose and changed, there was a swelling roar, then a steadying, then the long climbing rustle she was listening for, the sound of a whole nation walking upward, out of the dark into the dark above. She did not hurry it, she did not flinch when the air about her bare wrists grew loud with bees that did not sting her, that had never, since she was a child, found in her any of the fear that makes a hand snatch and a sting strike. When at last she lifted the upper skep away, and the under one stood empty of all but a few stragglers, and the abandoned, dripping wealth of the calm, Coram took off his hat. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man conceding a thing he has fought 60 years, that he had been told once, as a boy, by a Gloucestershire man, that it could be done so, and that he had never in his life seen it done, and that he supposed Mrs. Loder had chosen her heiress, with her eyes open. That was the sentence that traveled. It went from Coram to the home farm, and from the home farm to the smithy, and from the smithy to the church porch, and by the second Sunday in October half the parish of St. Dubricius had heard that the new mistress of Beeholt took the comb without killing the bees, drumming them up out of one house into another, with her own bare hands, and never avail. Some thought it womanish softness. More, when they had seen the pale heather comb she sent in jars to the curate's table, and to the lying in of Wren's married daughter, thought it uncommon good sense, for a spared colony was a colony that wintered and swarmed and paid again, where a brimstoned one paid once and was ash. The Reverend Owen Brace, mild and bookish and delighted to find his lone volume bearing fruit, preached that month on the lilies of the field and contrived, to Theodosia's quiet amusement, to bring the bees of the field into it before the second prayer. She had become, in the gentlest of ways and without lifting a finger to be so, a small local renown, not the dispossessed companion who had come west with one trunk and a legal cloud over her, but the woman at the Holt who could read a hive and would not burn one. It was on the strength of this, and on Wenna's coaxing and Mrs. Tranter's, that she let herself be persuaded to the autumn assembly at Leominster. She had no great wish for it. Half-mourning sat ill in a ballroom, and she had spent too many years as the useful shadow at the edge of other women's evenings to find candlelight and a card of dances anything but a kind of work. But Mrs. Tranter held that a mistress of an estate owed her face to the neighborhood, and Wenna held that her mistress should not pass the winter speaking to no one under 50 who was not a bee, and between the two of them Theodosia found herself, on a clear cold evening in the third week of October, handed down from the Holt's old chaise at the door of the Leominster Assembly Rooms in her one good gown of dove-grey lustring, the single jet brooch that held her father's hair at her throat, her dark honey hair pinned simply in her hands, for once, gloved, she danced twice, civilly, with men whose names she forgot before the music ended, and then withdrew with relief to the long window seat at the cool end of the room, where the press was thinnest, and a person might watch without being watched. It was there, between the second set and the third, that she became aware of being looked at, not boldly, not with the appraising glance she had learned to feel and to discount across 1,000 evenings as a paid companion, but steadily and from a little distance, the way she herself looked at a thing she meant to understand before she spoke of it. The man was tall and grave, perhaps 37, dressed with a plainness that in that glittering room read as either great economy or great consequence, and she saw before she saw anything else the black mourning band still at his sleeve. He did not approach. He spoke a word to their hostess, Mrs. Cleeve of the Priory, who glanced toward the window seat and then crossed the floor to Theodosia with the bright purposefulness of a woman delighted to be of use. The Marquis of Severnford, Mrs. Cleeve said, had asked the honor of an introduction. Theodosia rose. The name meant a little to her. Wren had spoken of Severnford as the great seat across the lug. 3,000 acres and a name older than the Conquest. The present Marquis, a man who had come to the title untimely 2 years since on his elder brother's death, and was reckoned in the neighborhood a sad, careful, decent sort, who did not entertain, and did not gamble, and was wasting, the matrons agreed, the best unmarried fortune in 3 counties on grief. He bowed over her gloved hand with a gravity that had nothing of the drawing-room in it. Crispin Aldwyn, 4th Marquis of Severnford, was grave-featured and quiet-eyed, a man who held himself very still, with a low baritone that he used sparingly, as though words cost him something, and he meant to spend them where they would tell. He did not pay her a single compliment. He said, instead, that he believed he had the pleasure of addressing the lady who kept the bees at B. Holt, and that he had heard, he hoped she would forgive the directness, that she had driven her stocks at the harvest rather than smother them, and that he had wished this 12-month to know whether the thing could truly be done. For his own bee-house at Severnford stood empty since his brother's old gardener died, and he had been told on all sides that there was no taking honey without killing for it. He added, more quietly, that he had in fact seen her once before, in the spring, walking the bee bank at the Holt as he rode the far bank of the lug about his own business, and had not known then who she was. Only that she went among the hives bare-handed and unafraid, and had carried the picture of it with him a good while after without quite meaning to. Theodosia looked at him a moment longer than she answered him. She had been listened at by many men, and indulged by a few, and asked a real question by almost none, and there was nothing in the grave attention of that still face that asked her to be charming about the bees, or quaint, or interestingly odd. He had asked her whether a thing could be done, as one practitioner asks another. So she told him. She said that it could be done, that she had done it that very fortnight, that it asked nothing but patience and a steady drumming, and a willingness to be wrong about how long it would take. He asked. And here the matrons watching from the card-room would have been astonished to see the sad Marquis of Severnford grow almost animated, whether she held by the old straw skeps or by the new wooden hives, for he had read of the octagon boxes and did not know what to think of them. It was the question she could have talked to until the candles guttered, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was talking. She said she kept both and trusted neither wholly, that the straw skep wintered warm and dry and cost a shilling, but you could not look inside it without breaking it, so that you kept your bees half by faith, that the wooden octagon let you lift a window and read the stock at a glance, which was a great matter for a person who liked to know a thing, rather than to hope it, but that it sweated in a wet spring and asked more of the keeper than most keepers would give. She said, too, that she kept a book of it, the weights and the swarm dates and the frosts, year upon year, and that a hive would tell you the truth if you only set down faithfully what it did, and did not flatter the page, and that more keepers came to grief by writing down what they wished than by any hard winter. He listened with his head a little bent, and when she had done he did not tell her she was charming, or that he had never heard a lady speak so. He said only, and slowly, that it seemed to him she trusted what she could verify, and was wary of what she could not, and that he had come to think the same way himself about most things, late and at some cost, and that he envied her having come to it through bees, rather than through grief. She had no answer ready for that, and was glad of the music striking up, for it gave them both a moment's grace. They did not dance. He did not ask her, and she understood, without being told, that the not asking was itself a courtesy, that a man with a mourning band at his sleeve and a still grief in his face did not bring a woman onto the floor under the eyes of 3 counties and so make her the subject of a fortnight's gossip before he had so much as walked with her in daylight. They stood at the window's edge instead while the set formed up, and spoke of the heather flow, and the late Perry Blossom, and of Gilbert White, whom he had read at school, and forgotten, and meant now to read again, and the half-hour went by so unlike the other half-hours of her evening, that when Mrs. Cleeve came at last to carry her off to be made known to somebody's aunt, Theodosia felt the interruption as a small, distinct loss, and was careful not to let it show. He found her again only once, near the end, when the chaises were being called, and the cold came in at the open doors. He bowed his grave bow. He said that his seat lay but 4 miles by the river from B. Holt, that he should be passing the Holt in the ordinary way of his autumn business about the home park, and that, if she would not think it an impertinence in a man so newly known to her, he would be glad to be permitted to call, that he might see the bee bank she had spoken of, and the manner of the driving for himself. Against the day he set his own bee house in order. He asked it plainly, as he asked everything, with no flourish to hide behind, and his quiet eyes rested on her face while he waited, and Theodosia, who had spent a lifetime granting other people's small permissions and asking none for herself, found that she was, after all, mistress of a thing now that was wholly hers to open, or to close, and that she wished to open it. She said that he would be very welcome to call at B. Holt, and that he would find the bees better worth the journey than herself, and saw, for the first time that evening, the grave mouth move towards something that was almost a smile before he bowed once more, and was gone into the cold and the lantern light of the waiting carriages. He came on a Tuesday, as he had said he would, and he came on foot, which Theodosia had not expected, and would remember a long while after. A marquis might have sent his carriage the 4 miles round by the bridge, and let the lane announce him with wheels and a coachman's livery. Crispin Aldwyn walked it instead, across the lug by the stepping stones below the mill and up through the perry orchard, so that the first B. Holt knew of his arrival was the old Tabby Bramble lifting her head on the honey-house sill and a tall figure in plain dark riding dress coming between the pear trees with his hat in his hand. The mourning band was still at his sleeve, a narrow strip of black for the brother he had not yet finished grieving, and he wore it as he wore everything, without remark, as a fact of himself, rather than a flag of feeling. Mrs. Edith Tranter saw him first from the still-room window, and came to find her mistress, with her keys chiming, and her iron grey hair escaping its linen cap, and she said only that the gentleman from across the water was in the garden, and had not waited to be carried in like a parcel, which from Mrs. Tranter was something near to approval. Theodosia was at the bee bank when he reached it, which was where she was most mornings, and where he had perhaps hoped to find her. She had her ungloved hands at the new wooden octagon hive, her sleeves turned back, the dove gray of her gown softened now to an ordinary working gray, for she had put off the deepest half-mourning with the turn of the year, and kept only the jet brooch at her throat that held her father's hair. She did not start at his coming. She finished the thing she was doing, which was to lay her palm flat against the side of the hive and listen, the level gray-green eyes resting on nothing while she read by ear the deep contented note within, and only then did she straighten and turn and give him good morning. He told her afterward that this was the moment he had been most afraid of and most wanting, that she would treat the calling of a marquise as an event to be performed around, and that she had instead treated it as a thing that might wait until the hive had been heard. It was, he said, the most courteous thing anyone had done him in a year of being bowed to. They walked the home park together that first Tuesday, and Mr. Jago Wren, who happened to have business at the orchard gate that took a remarkably long while, kept them in the corner of his weather-creased eye the whole length of it, and reported to the kitchen that the Marquis asked more questions than he answered, and seemed in no hurry to be gone. They walked the 51 acres of the Holt by their old field names, the Hithercroft and the Parson's Half and the long meadow they called Lugside, and Crispin asked her about the Perry pears, whether the old standard trees still bore, and about the home farm, whether Wren meant to keep the red cattle, or go over to the new short horns, and she answered him plainly and asked him as many things back, for she had never in her life been able to be talked at for long, without wanting to know the why of the speaker. And at the bee bank he stopped, and looked at the row of straw skeps, and the one wooden octagon among them, like a gentleman in a dark coat among a row of pale country cousins, and he asked her, gravely, as though it mattered, because to her it did, whether she had settled in her own mind which wintered the better, the skep or the box. It was the question he had asked her at the Lea Minster Assembly, the question that had begun the whole of it, and she knew that he had brought it back to her on purpose, as a man brings back a thing held in common to show it has not been forgotten. So she told him, walking, the truth as her year had taught it, that the skep kept the warmth close, and the cluster snug, and asked nothing of a frame maker, but that you could not look within it, without the breaking of comb, and that the wouldn't have let you lift and see and judge the weight of stores without the killing. and that she had come to think the future lay with the box for that reason above all others, that she would rather drive her bees down into a fresh skep at harvest, and let them live, than smother a whole stock over a brimstone pit to take its honey, as the old way did, and as half the parish still did. She said it without heat, as a settled opinion arrived at by watching. And Crispin Aldwyn listened to the whole of it, with his head a little bowed and his hat still in his hand, and when she had done he did not say, as the Leominster gentleman had said, that it was charming in a lady to take up such a study. He said that he had lost 3 stocks himself last winter at Severnford, for want of knowing their weight before the cold came. And might he send his man over to look at how she had set her bank to the south? That was all. But it was the difference between being indulged and being believed, and Theodosia, who had spent 26 years being useful to others and owned of her own competence until this house had handed it back to her, knew the difference to the bone. He called again the Tuesday following, and the Tuesday after that, until the lane grew used to the tall figure coming over the stepping stones, and Mrs. Tranter ceased to announce him as the gentleman from across the water and called him the Marquis plainly. And when a Tranter, who had become Theodosia's daily companion, and read aloud to her of an evening from the curate's borrowed volume of Mr. White's Selborne letters, took to setting a 3rd cup without being told. The courting was a slow and a wintering thing, fitted to the season. There was no pressing in it. He did not come at her with the speed of a man who fears to lose a prize to a rival, for there was no rival, and he seemed to understand, as few would have, that a woman lately come into the first thing she had ever owned will want a little while to be sure of her own ground before she shares it. He brought her, once, a book, not a novel, not a thing of sentiment, but a stout treatise on the management of bees by a Yorkshire clergyman, and he had cut the pages himself, and marked 2 places where the author was, he thought, plainly wrong, and asked her whether he had judged it right. He had. They argued the second of the 2 places for the better part of an afternoon in the south parlour with the fire low and Bramble asleep on the hearth, and the Reverend Owen Brace, calling to return a borrowed key, found them at it, and went away again smiling into his collar. For he had recommended White's letters to her at the first, and saw what came of recommending books to people who read them. The Dowager Marchioness of Severnford came to the Holt in the 2nd week of February, in her son's carriage and her own black furs, and Theodosia received her in the south parlour, under the chimney-piece, where she had hung the portrait miniature of Mrs. Sabina Loder, enlarged to a proper framed likeness, the godmother she had met but once and come to know wholly through a ledger and a bundle of letters. The dowager was a gentle, slow-spoken woman who had buried a younger son the year before, and carried her grief the way her elder son carried his, quietly and without display, and she looked a long while at Theodosia's stung roughened hands and her sun-touched face that no chaperone had ever quite scolded pale, and she did not seem to find them wanting. She asked to be shown the bees. It was cold for it, the bank rhymed, and the skeps capped with old snow, but Theodosia took her out wrapped to the eyes, and showed her the hives, and told her how each was named and weighed, and the dowager, listening, said at last that her son had spoken of nothing else for a month, and that she had come prepared to dislike whatever had so taken him, and found, to her inconvenience, that she could not. Coming from a marchioness in furs at a frozen bee bank, it was as near to a blessing as the thing could be given, and both women knew it, and neither said more. He asked her in March, on the bank, between the skeps, on a grey still afternoon with the first scout bees venturing out to the snowdrops under the orchard wall. He did not go upon his knee, for which she was glad, the ground being cold, and the gesture not his. He stood and looked at her a moment longer than most men would before speaking, which was her own trick turned back upon her, and which made her want to laugh, and very nearly did. He said that he had watched her be right, when no one in the room believed her. Meaning the long-gone morning of the green baize table, and the ledger, and Sir Cuthbert Voil's collapsing claim, of which he had heard the whole from Mr. Halloran Pike, who could not keep a good piece of justice to himself, and that he had thought ever since that a man who could spend his life beside a woman who was right when it was costly to be right, would be a fortunate man, and that he was asking, plainly and without any pretty turn to it, because she would see through a pretty turn, whether she would make him that fortunate man, and be his wife. And Theodosia Marchmont, who did not perform distress, and would not perform rapture either, looked at him with her level gray-green eyes, and her father's brooch at her throat, and the dead godmother's hives ranked about them like witnesses, and she said, "I shall." Not "I will," with its breathless tremor, but "I shall," the plain future tense of a woman stating a thing she had decided and meant to see done. He said afterward it was the finest 2 words he had heard in his life, and that he would not have had her say them any other way. The banns were read 3 Sundays running at St. Dubricius at Marden-under-Croft, the Reverend Owen Brace standing up in his mild and bookish way to publish the marriage between Crispin Aldwyn, 4th Marquess of Severnford, of the parish of Severnford, and Theodosia Marchmont, spinster, of this parish, and asking if any new cause or just impediment, and the 3rd Sunday old Hesketh Coram the bee skepmaker, 70 years old and present at every bee matter in the parish for half a century, was heard to murmur from the back pew that there was none, which was not strictly his office, but which no one had the heart to check. The parish had taken Theodosia for its own over the autumn and the winter, for she had read to the school children and sat with the sick and, what told most of all in a Marches village, she had driven her bees down humanely at the harvest rather than smothering the stocks over brimstone. And folk who had lost good honey years to the old killing way came to the bank to watch her do it, and went home thoughtful. They would not lose her to the great house across the lug. The bargain, plainly understood though never spoken, was that Beeholt remained hers, and that the Marchioness of Severnford would keep her own apiary in her own parish, and cross the water to it as her husband crossed it to her. She was married in the spring, at St. Dubricius, on a morning of pear blossoms so full and white that the lane up to the church was roofed with it. She wore not bridal silk, but a gown of soft pale gray, half a shade lighter than her mourning had been, and the jet brooch with her father's hair, for she would carry the dead to the altar as gladly as the living, and over the chimney-piece at home, Mrs. Sabina Loder's likeness kept the house while its mistress was at church. The parish gathered along the lane the whole way, the Tranters and Jago Wren in his best coat that smelled of camphor, and Hesketh Coram leaning on his stick, and Wenna with the school children strewing the last of the blossom, and the Dowager Marchioness in her furs put off for spring grey, and Mr. Halloran piked down from Hereford with his gold-rimmed spectacles fogging. 61 years old and unaccountably moved. The Reverend Owen Brace married them in a voice that did not shake until the very end, and Theodosia gave her plain answer, "I will now where the form required it," but the same settled spirit in it as the "I shall" on the bank had had. And Crispin Aldwyn put the ring upon her stung roughened hand as though it were the most natural place in the world for a ring to go. They did not go far for the wedding journey. He took her up the Wye a little way and back within the fortnight, for it was swarming season coming, and neither of them was the sort to be 100 miles off when the first cast might hang in the Perry pairs. She came back to Beeholt the Marchioness of Severnford, and the mistress of the Holt, both. And the two did not war in her as the parish had half feared they might. She crossed the lug to Severnford, and learned its great rooms, and was kind to its old servants, and was a grave courteous lady there, but the place that was hers, the place she rose early for, was always the south-facing bank above the lug, with its row of skeps, and its growing rank of wooden hives. And here the trait that had begun the whole of it, that had brought a swarm to the bare hands of an 11-year-old girl, and made a dead gentlewoman choose her out of all the family for an heiress, came round to its last and quietest surfacing. For Theodosia kept her own bee-book now, begun the year before as a continuation of Mrs. Loder's 30-year ledger, and grown thick with her own hand's swarm dates and hive weights and frost notes, and of an evening, when the day's work was done, and the fire was low, and Bramble asleep upon the hearth, the Marquess of Severnford would sit beside his wife while she wrote the day's small bee news into it, and he did not read over her shoulder as a man humors a hobby. He asked her what she had set down, and why, and what it told her of the year to come, and he remembered her answers, and when at the spring shows the gentlemen spoke of their stocks he would say, "My wife keeps a book of it, and let her be sent for," and watch the room learn what he had learned on a grey afternoon, at a frozen bank, that her knowing was a true and useful and authoritative thing, and that the right place for it was the head of the table, and not the corner of the parlor. There was, in the second spring, a christening. A daughter was born to the Marchioness of Severnford at Beeholt itself, the mistress having declined to be brought to bed anywhere but in the house her godmother had left her, and she was carried down the blossom-roofed lane to St. Dubricius, and christened by the Reverend Owen Brace, who had married her parents on the very same flags, and named Sabina for the dead gentlewoman whose ledger had saved the apiary, and whose portrait hung above the south parlor chimney, that the name might go on in the house it had loved. When a tranter stood godmother and wept without shame, and old Hesketh Coram, who would not see another such spring, was helped to the front this time and said the child had a steady look about the eyes already, like one who would calm a swarm bare-handed before she was 12, which everyone took for the prophecy of a doting old man, and which Theodosia, holding her daughter at the font, was privately and fiercely inclined to believe. The Dowager Marchioness wrote that she was content, which from her was a great deal, and Mr. Pike sent a christening cup of plain Hereford silver, with no engraving on it but the date, and Bramble the old tabby slept through the whole of it on the honey-house sill and was not disturbed. There are stories that begin with a kiss, and there are stories that begin with a swarm hanging quiet in the pear blossom, and a child's bare hands cupped beneath it unafraid, and the bee-bank above the lug knew which of the two had made this one, and kept its counsel, and hummed. So it was that Theodosia, once a dismissed lady's companion, who had owned nothing and been useful to all, came to be at the last what she remained to the end of a long and honeyed life, mistress of Beeholt and Marchioness of Severnford, and the only soul in 2 parishes who could read a hive by its weight and its hum, and be believed.